Hey guys, I have an exciting guest. Zach Bitter is here. Zach is an endurance athlete, ultra endurance athlete, 100 miles he runs. I mean, incredible. World and American record holder. So thanks for doing this, Zach, and welcome to my little interview here.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Now, Zach's going to be one of our speakers, guys, at the summit. So I'm really excited to pick his brain and find out how the heck that he runs 100 miles. And not only just running 100 miles, but taking the record. And also, you actually this is in America, right? But in the world, you've taken some records too, right?
Yeah, I have an American record for 100 miles, and that's just the time it takes to run 100 miles, and that's 11 hours, 40 minutes, and 55 seconds. I also was able to kind of double dip a bit with that because I also have a world record, which is distance run in 12 hours. So I've run 101.7 miles in a 12-hour time frame. The
Wow.
ultra running community is goofy enough where they have distance races and timed event races and all kinds of other things. So it's that's kind of where my niche has been the last few years.
Wow. So a couple things I want to know. Like this is like on average 7-minute mile, right?
Yeah.
So that's like you're trucking. You're not like jogging slowly. You have a really good pace. And then how do you know when you have to, like, do you just go by thirst and hunger? Like, how do you know you have to eat or drink before you kind of like, I'm going to pass out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess, that's definitely been something that's changed for me. Like before I had ever done a 100-mile race, I'd done a whole bunch of 50-mile races. And one thing I kind of noticed was that in order to kind of feel decent or feel like I wasn't going to kind of crash and burn, I would have to take in tons and tons of carbohydrates, like to the tune of 400 calories an hour. And a lot of it is pretty simple because you're moving, so it's hard to take in a complex energy source during the exercise, and that kind of catches up to you. Your gut is still trying to process all of that, and your body needs the energy, presumably, but your gut has to also handle it. And one thing I noticed is, like, by the end of those races, you just kind of feel bloated and kind of disgusting, and it was like, kind of a question in the back of my mind was always like, well, how do you do that for 50 more miles or, further yet? And, that wasn't the only thing I noticed, which kind of led me to a different approach. But, what I do now, since I'm following a high fat approach, is I can get away with a lot less fuel while I'm running because I've essentially tapped into a much larger fuel tank, which is body fat. And the way I like to view that is, even at the leanest state, like, an athlete has got a much bigger body fat reserve than they do glycogen stores. So if you can teach your body to burn a high level of body fat, you minimize the amount of carbohydrates you need. And then you also bypass the digestive system when you're, taking fuel right off your body as opposed to through eating food in the event itself. So what I found is just a lot of trial and error and workouts and races and things like that is that if I am going to race, an ultra marathon and it's going to be kind of a peak effort, I'm usually aiming for about 100 to 200 calories an hour. And then depending on the weather will depend a little bit how I kind of structure that. So like if it's hot enough or even kind of room temperature, which is actually considered kind of warm for running, I'll tie a lot of those calories to the hydration and I'll just drink to thirst and try to make sure, whoever's crewing for me is putting in the right amount of fuel into that. And usually I'll do that with like a carbohydrate source, and that being similar to the reasoning I gave before, where my glycogen stores are the small tank. That's the one I potentially need to reload in the event itself. The body fat, I can take care of that afterwards. If I get awfully lean from running a 100-mile race, I can just, add a bunch of butter to the steak after the race and catch back up on that post race and worry about, that sort of thing then. But yeah, you get pretty intuitive, I think. And one of the benefits of having what I would consider a very clean, healthy, biologically appropriate diet is like my body's pretty good at telling me when I'm hungry and when I'm thirsty. And I don't necessarily fight that. So if I do get hungry or something during a race or thirsty, I trust that it means I need something.
And then I guess you also have to, at some point, use the bathroom.
Yeah. Yeah. Efficiency is part of the variables that come into the ultra running stuff. And, at my best in an event called Desert Solstice Track Invitational, where I actually broke that 100-mile American record, I think I stopped twice to use the bathroom for probably a total of 60 to 90 seconds. But other than that, I was moving the entire day. So some of it is just kind of playing a balancing act. And I think that's where it also kind of becomes really important to be in tune with your body, because I want to hydrate enough to not lose performance, but I don't want to hydrate to the degree where I'm stopping every, couple of miles to use the bathroom or something like that. So
So
I had it
so
pretty dialed in that day.
so that's interesting. Now you're competing against a lot of guys that are doing the carbo loading thing, right? They're
Yeah.
doing carbs, right? And they're not doing high fat. They're doing probably, well, I don't know what they're doing, but they're just doing a lot of carbohydrates.
hmm
Are these guys stopping very frequently, urinating, and like because of fluids?
Uh, I don't know if they're necessarily, the people are taking in fuel and all sorts of stuff. Some people are taking in like gel packs or like bars and things like that. So they're not necessarily tying their nutrition to hydration. And, one of the reasons I've liked this approach is because that is a huge logistic in ultra running. Like, even guys like myself and guys like Jeff Browning, who's another kind of high fat ultra marathon runner, we're still consuming calories during the event, but that logistic is just way more manageable and a lot smaller to kind of work through during an event than, say, like I was earlier when I was taking in easily twice as much, if not more. And then, that's pretty typical, I think, for a lot of the other athletes that are high carb, is that kind of 300 to sometimes 400 calories an hour type of a format. So, yeah, I mean, I think you just set yourself up for more potential problems, in the 100-mile distance. There's no shortage of stories of people getting sidelined at mile 70, 80 and puking up gels and sports drinks and all that sort of stuff. So, it's a pretty wide range of what people can tolerate. Some are better at it than others. And I suspect that the folks that stick around on the carb wagon are the ones that just happen to be able to tolerate it a little more than others. And some people kind of come over to the high fat world just because they've had those experiences where they realize I need to take in this much with my current diet, but I can't. So, that usually kind of is a good indicator that you need to change something. And there's other variables too that kind of affect that. Like heat plays a big role. If it gets hot out, it becomes harder to digest, and your body's trying to use blood volume for a variety of different purposes. So to kind of use it for copious amounts of digestion as well as taking away from some of the other performance-based functions. And it's just a lot of kind of interesting aspects to the sport that kind of, it's all running, but it's just a lot more variables when you're out there all day long versus for, half an hour or an hour or even 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, when you train for a 100-mile race, how many miles do you run every day to train, or do you run every other day? How do you structure your
hmm
training?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in the endurance world specifically, I think a lot of times you'll see someone like nail a race, and people will look at what did they do to build up, and they'll look at those 8 weeks kind of leading into the race, and they'll put a lot of stock in what they did in those 8 weeks, when in reality, most guys and gals who are breaking records or competing at a high level, they've got years and years, if not decades, of running experience that they've kind of been building off of. So, I've certainly kind of fit into that mold where, I've been doing kind of a very high volume training approach for quite some time now. And it does ebb and flow throughout the year as I'm kind of recovering from events or recovering from big training sessions and stuff like that. But the way I do it is I kind of periodize things. So like after an A race, I'll kind of shut it down. I'll give myself like at least 2 weeks if I need it to not do anything structured. Usually my body comes back around quite a bit quicker than that. And then I'll just do some kind of light running and start building up just kind of low intensity stuff. And I'll work up to usually well over 100 miles a week. Then I'll start adding in some specific stuff depending on what race I'm doing next and what race I'm preparing for. A lot of times I'll try to keep the workouts that are least specific to the race pace kind of earlier in the training. So once I have that aerobic base kind of established, I'll be doing maybe some shorter intervals earlier in the training session. some shorter, speedy stuff like that. And then as I get closer to the race itself, I'll be putting a lot more effort and energy into like making sure I get in the long runs, which, for me usually are in the neighborhood of 30, sometimes 50 miles in length. And then like longer interval or tempo type sessions. So, I've had a variety of different kind of peak mileage weeks. When I broke the American record, I had a 3-week block where I think I had like 130 mile, 150 mile, and 170 mile week, or somewhere right around there. And then that kind of led into my taper. And that was what I would call one of maybe a more aggressive high mileage training blocks. I've done other ones where it's a little lower, where I've averaged closer to around 120 miles for maybe a little longer time, and just kind of put a little more stock in consistency as opposed to one really, really big block. But yeah, it's when you back out and look at the year as a whole, I probably average, or at least I have historically averaged a little over 100 miles a week when you add in all the rest days and the big training days and stuff like that. So it's definitely time consuming no matter how you kind of look at it.
Yeah. And then the day before, do you do anything? You're not training the day before.
I'll do some light running usually. It's all relative at that point. I think, like if, when I taper, I'll scale things back, but I won't necessarily completely shut it down. Cause I don't want, it's a fine line, but I don't want to like teach my body that like I haven't been doing anything either. I just want to give it enough rest to be ready for the race itself. So a lot of times that means I'm just about 2 or 3 weeks out, kind of cutting down volume and intensity gradually throughout that time frame until I get to the race itself. So, I've done as much as an hour easy run before a 100-mile race. But I have taken off completely too. A lot of times that last week, it's a lot of listening to my body. If I'm feeling sharp already, then, I'll probably be a little less aggressive with like off days, and still get some light running in and kind of keep that locomotion intact.
And then, as far as what you're eating the day before, are you having a little more carbs, or to build up a little glycogen reserve? Or are you just kind of going what you feel like? Because I mean, it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, the carbo loading phenomenon, I guess, has, I think, gotten really goofy over the last few years, where it's almost become, I think, more of a celebration than it has an actual like tactical thing, where, people will go to these big pasta feeds and stuff just as part of the event itself. And, I've kind of tried to put the carbo load back into perspective to what I think it was originally intended to do. So for me, like carb planning for an event actually starts probably about 7 days out, 6 or 7 days out. And the way I kind of structure it is I'll spend the first 4 to 5 days of that week going really low carb, like kind of clinical ketogenic or almost zero carb type of an approach. And I'm really just trying to set myself up to be like really heavy fat burning in those days. And it makes a lot of sense because, like I said before, that's when my training is kind of ramping down. So I really don't have a whole lot of need for carbohydrate from a training standpoint at that point. And it also kind of, I think, that cycle will make my glycogen stores pretty sensitive to anything I do take in the 2 days or so before the race. So then when if it's like a Saturday race, maybe Thursday night, I'll start kind of sneaking some carbs back in with dinner, and then some carbs during the meals the day before and things like that. And, for me, a lot of the ones that have worked well for me are like sweet potatoes, berries, melons, raw honey, and that sort of type of carbohydrate is usually what you'll find kind of on my plate or in my tea or whatever, alongside some of the fats and proteins that would be more typical.
Wow. Fascinating. Hey guys, we're talking to Zach Bitter, and he's going to be one of the speakers at the summit. And there's a couple of things that you told me. We're not going to get into them, but you're experimenting, researching on your own body about proteins in relationship to quantities of protein and ratios of carbs, and you're finding some interesting things. So you're going to be sharing that, right? You're going to talk about protein, which is kind of like a new territory, because it's like there's not a lot of people that do what you do in the area of and eat what you eat. So you could just basically read a book. You're kind of creating this thing as you go, and you're experimenting on your body, because if it doesn't work, you're going to find out. That's simply because there's no way you're going to last, that long to do this. So I think it's like your body is kind of a great tool to get feedback to see what's working, what's not. And then you're also going to be talking about electrolytes. And I think you also, did you do that interview with Dr. Noakes?
Yeah, we actually just released that one to public. It's episode 29 of the Human Performance Outliers podcast, if folks are interested. And we dove into electrolytes, hydration, as well as nutrition on that one. So, yeah, it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
And central governor theory too, I suppose, which I guess plays a role in hydration and electrolytes, perhaps.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, like, he's the guy that started the whole carbo thing with I think it's called the goo, right? And he was like promoting that until him, I guess, 3 friends got diabetes and said, wait a second, this is the problem. This is not good. And then I'm not sure. Oh yeah. He told me he was, the whole water thing. Like it was like hardly, when he started out, they weren't even drinking any water. And then they started drinking a lot of water. People were dying. And then he wrote a book on, I think it's called Waterlogged. And
correct. Yeah.
Fascinating. So, yeah. So because guys, if you've never heard about it, there's a condition called hyponatremia, which is basically you're drinking too much water and you're depleting your sodium, which you need for muscle physiology in your heart, and your brain can swell and you can basically get a heart attack. So people have died. So there's a technology to electrolytes and fluids, and at the summit, Zach is going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm excited about that. And I was going to, I won't take too much of your time, but I wanted to find out, like, here you are, you're going to run, maybe like you're going to run on a flat surface on a track, and you're going to go 100 miles. How do you confront doing this repetitive? It seemed like it'd be so boring for hour after hour running the same thing over. Like, how do you mentally do that? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a little different. And in the United States, I think like with ultra marathoning, the trail scene has kind of been the one that's picked up the most momentum in terms of popularity. And one of the appealing reasons for that, I think, is because your scenery is constantly changing. You're seeing some of the most beautiful areas of the country, and you can kind of bank some mental energy on that you're kind of experiencing this area. But when you hop on a 400-meter high school track, you don't have that luxury necessarily. You're kind of completely exposed, and you're going to see the same thing over and over all day long. So I think the approach, certainly from a mental side, is quite a bit different, where on one hand, logistically, it's super easy. So you can have peace of mind knowing that you can get whatever you want every 400 meters. There's always people there. The environment's never going to throw you for a curve for the most part, minus some weird weather system coming through. So you kind of have a lot of those things that you can rely on being consistent. But then, you have to be able to put up with the monotony. So for me, it's always been like, doing a lot of like kind of, I guess the best way to maybe describe it is zoning out. And it's like, it's more or less just kind of getting a rhythm. Like if I do the training right and I kind of have an idea of where my fitness is at, which I have a fairly easy time doing, the training's not necessarily easy, but becoming in tune with where I'm at is pretty easy because I've just done it so many times now, where I can almost just kind of get in a rhythm, and I'm not necessarily fixating too heavily on pace. I can kind of just dial in an intensity or a perceived effort, and then just kind of more or less daydream or try to picture myself somewhere else other than the track. It does get a little more difficult near the end because, as you can imagine, 80 miles into a 100-mile run, your body's getting a little worn down, and you're getting a little tired of being out there, and your mind starts to kind of convince your body that it needs to stop or slow down. So it's a little more difficult to really hit the splits intuitively, and then you kind of have to pay a little more attention to kind of watching your pace, which for me tends to kind of slow the clock down in my mind, because then I'm just, looking at it more often, and that's where it kind of gets a little more difficult. You have to push through some of the mental hurdles.
Do you have like, for me, what seems probably would happen is I would have all of a sudden my left knee will start talking and like
Hmm.
hurting, and then my shoulder will. Do you have like things that kind of just turn on like on your body until you just run and all of a sudden they'll go away, just push through it?
Yeah, to some degree, it is kind of interesting. A lot of I think this physical toll, it almost hits a plateau, and then it's just about being able to kind of keep pushing through that kind of low dull pain, or that low dull like annoyance, I guess is a way to say it. I usually try to compare it to the opposite, whereas like someone's racing like a 3 kilometer or 5 kilometer race, you know their peace of mind is that it's over relatively quick. But the hard part is it's kind of a sharp pain. It's really intense pain that you don't want to last too long. Whereas with 100 miles, it's like it's not anything really drastic that you wouldn't be able to handle for a few minutes at a time. But over the course of hours and hours, it kind of eats away at you, and it kind of, the way I describe it is, it depletes your mental energy, and then you just develop less patience to be able to tolerate it. And I think that's where the whole mental side of the sport becomes that much more important, because a lot of it comes down to how much are you willing to kind of push through versus other days where you're maybe not able to push through as much.
Wow, interesting. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to have you at the event, and so I hope you guys could make it. It's going to be this October 13th and 14th. So I'll put some information down below. So thank you so much, Zach.